This message is not random, and you didn't just stumble onto this by accident. Something in your life has already been shifting quietly, at first almost unnoticeable, like a subtle change in the air before a storm breaks. You've felt it. That unshakable sense deep inside that something wasn't adding up even when everything on the surface looked normal. You couldn't explain it in a way that satisfied other people. You didn't have hard proof to lay on the table, but you knew. And that knowing didn't come from fear, it didn't come from insecurity. It came from a place deeper than logic, a place most people ignore because it requires them to confront what they don't want to see. But instead of being heard, instead of someone pausing and asking why you felt that way, you were labeled. They called you too sensitive. They said you were overthinking. Some even went as far as calling you paranoid, as if your awareness was some kind of flaw that needed to be corrected. But what if the very thing they tried to silence in you was actually your greatest strength? What if your ability to see what others couldn't wasn't the problem, but the reason things are starting to unravel now, Tay? With me, because by the time you reach the end of this message, the confusion you've been carrying is going to turn into clarity, and the doubt they planted in your mind is going to lose its grip. And before we go any deeper, take a moment right now to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. I trust what I discern. You're not just interacting with content. You're making a decision about who you choose to believe moving forward, and that decision changes everything. You felt it before there was proof, and that is where most people get lost, because the world has trained them to only trust what can be seen, measured, or confirmed by someone else. But your experience did not begin with evidence. It began with a quiet disturbance in your spirit that refused to be ignored. It didn't arrive loudly, it didn't come with a clear explanation. It came as a subtle tension, a slight misalignment between what was being said and what was actually felt, like hearing music that was just a fraction off-key, enough that you couldn't relax into it, even if everyone else seemed perfectly comfortable. You noticed things that didn't match, not in dramatic, obvious ways, but in small, almost invisible fractures that most people overlook because they are too focused on appearances, too eager to accept what is presented to them at face value. You started picking up on the pauses between words, the way someone's tone shifted when certain topics came up, the way energy in a room subtly changed, depending on who was present. And even though you tried to brush it off at first, telling yourself you might be overanalyzing, that maybe you were reading too much into it, that inner signal did not fade, it grew stronger, more persistent, more insistent that something deeper was happening beneath the surface. And that's the part that made it uncomfortable, because when you sense something, you cannot yet prove, you are left standing in a space where you feel alone with your perception, where your awareness is ahead of your ability to explain it. And that gap can feel isolating if you don't understand what's really happening. But let me make this clear to you, that feeling was not random, it was not irrational, and it was not a flaw in your thinking. It was your discernment activating before the situation had fully revealed itself. Most people wait for confirmation before they allow themselves to believe what they feel. But you were receiving signals early, long before the evidence surfaced, and that is not weakness, that is precision. You were noticing patterns, not isolated incidents, patterns that repeated in subtle variations, like a script being played out in different scenes. And even when you tried to ignore it, those patterns kept presenting themselves, reinforcing the same message in slightly different ways, until it became impossible to dismiss. You may have told yourself to give people the benefit of the doubt, to assume good intentions, to not jump to conclusions, and there is nothing wrong with that. But what you were experiencing was not about jumping to conclusions. It was about recognizing consistency in behavior that did not align with the image being projected. And the more you paid attention, the more you realized that what you were sensing wasn't about one moment. It was about a sequence, a buildup, a collection of signals that, when placed together, formed a picture that others were either unable or unwilling to see. And this is where your strength began to separate you from the crowd. Because while others were comfortable staying at the surface, you were naturally drawn to what was underneath, to what didn't quite fit, to what required deeper observation. You didn't need someone to tell you that something was off. You felt it in real time. And even when you couldn't articulate it perfectly, your internal compass was already adjusting, already guiding you to pay closer attention, to remain alert, to not fully relax into what was being presented. And understand this, the discomfort you felt was not something to be feared. It was information, it was your mind and your spirit working together to signal that there was more to the situation than what was visible. And instead of honoring that signal, you were made to question it. You may have replayed moments in your head wondering if you were being too cautious, too observant, too aware, questioning whether it would be easier to just ignore what you felt and move on like everyone else seemed to be doing. But every time you tried to silence that inner voice, it came back, not louder in volume, but stronger in certainty. That is because truth has a frequency, and once you tune into it even slightly, it becomes very difficult to completely disconnect from it. And while others were operating on what was convenient, what was socially acceptable, what maintained comfort and avoided confrontation, you were operating on what was real even when that reality was not yet visible to anyone else. You were ahead of the timeline, and being ahead often feels like being wrong when you are surrounded by people who are behind. But let me shift your perspective right here, because what you experienced in that season was not confusion. It was clarity without confirmation, and that is one of the hardest positions to stand in, because you are carrying awareness that has not yet been validated externally. It requires a level of internal stability to trust what you feel before the world agrees with you. And even if you didn't fully trust yourself at the time, even if you doubted, even if you questioned, you still didn't completely ignore it. And that matters more than you realize. Because the fact that you kept noticing, the fact that you kept paying attention, the fact that you didn't completely shut down, your perception is exactly why you are now in a position just to understand what others are just beginning to see. You were not imagining things, you were interpreting signals early, and the only reason it felt like a burden is because you were carrying it before it became obvious to everyone else. And now, as things begin to unfold, as patterns become clearer, as actions start aligning with what you once only sensed, you are starting to recognize that what you felt in the beginning was never baseless. It was simply ahead of its time. And as that awareness inside you kept rising, as the quiet signals became too consistent to ignore, you eventually reached a point where you tried to express what you were sensing, not in a dramatic way, not to accuse, not to create conflict, but simply to bring light to something that didn't feel right. And instead of being met with curiosity, or even a moment of pause, you were met with dismissal, as if your perception itself was the problem, as if the issue wasn't what you were noticing, but the fact that you were noticing it at all. And that response did something subtle but powerful. It attempted to shift the focus away from the truth and place it directly onto you, turning your awareness into something questionable rather than something worth examining. You weren't corrected with facts. You weren't shown evidence that you were wrong, you were labeled, and labels are one of the easiest ways to control a narrative without having to address the substance of what's being said. Because once someone is called too sensitive or overthinking, Everything they say afterward can be filtered through that lens, dismissed before it's even considered. And this is where the deeper dynamic begins to reveal itself, because that kind of response is not about truth. It's about preservation. It's about protecting an illusion that cannot survive honest observation. You have to understand, when people are invested in maintaining a certain image, whether it's about themselves, a situation, or a system, they benefit from any form of clarity becomes a threat. Not because clarity is harmful, but because it exposes what they are trying to keep hidden. And rather than dismantle what's false, it is often easier for them to discredit the one who sees clearly. So when you spoke even gently, even with uncertainty, even leaving room for the possibility that you might be wrong, the reaction you received was disproportionate to what you actually said, and that disproportion is a signal in itself, because truth does not need aggression to defend itself, but illusion often does. You may have noticed how quickly the tone shifted, how the conversation moved away from the issue and became about your perception, your mindset, your supposed flaws. And in that moment, the goal was not to understand you. The goal was to make you question yourself enough that you would stop looking, stop asking, stop seeing. And for a while it may have worked not completely, but enough to create hesitation, enough to make you second-guess your own instincts, enough to make you wonder if it would be easier to just let it go and align with what everyone else seemed to accept without question. But here's what most people don't realize, and what you are beginning to see now: dismissal is not a neutral reaction. It is an active strategy, because when something cannot be logically defended, it is often emotionally redirected. And that redirection usually targets the person who is asking the question, rather than the question itself. Think about it. If what you were sensing was truly baseless, if there was nothing there, it could have been easily clarified, easily resolved, easily addressed in a way that brought understanding. But instead, you were met with resistance, with minimization, with subtle or even direct attempts to make you feel like your perception was unreliable. And that tells you something very important. It tells you that your awareness was touching something real. People do not go out of their way to silence what has no impact. They react strongly to what threatens to reveal something they are not ready to have exposed. And this is where the deeper layer of your experience begins to make sense, because the way they responded to you was not random. It followed a pattern that is used whenever someone wants to maintain control over a narrative. Without addressing its weaknesses, first comes dismissal, then comes labeling, then comes subtle isolation, making you feel like you are the only one who sees things this way, and finally comes the attempt to normalize the very thing that felt off to you, so that questioning it seems unnecessary or even unreasonable. And when you are in the middle of that, when you are the one experiencing it in real time, it can feel confusing, because you are balancing what you feel internally with what is being presented externally. And when those two things don't match, it creates tension, a kind of mental and emotional pressure that makes you want to resolve the conflict as quickly as possible, often by adjusting your perception to match the environment, rather than questioning the environment itself. But you didn't fully do that, did you? Even if you tried to convince yourself to let it go. Even if you told yourself it wasn't worth the energy, something in you stayed alert. Something in you refused to completely surrender your awareness. And that is why you are now able to look back and see that what happened was not just a misunderstanding, it was a deliberate deflection. They dismissed you to protect something, whether they were fully conscious of it or not, whether it was intentional or simply a learned behavior. The effect was the same. Your clarity was treated as a problem because it disrupted a version of reality that others were invested in maintaining. And here's the shift you need to make now, because this is where many people get stuck. You have to stop interpreting their dismissal as evidence that you were wrong, and start seeing it as evidence that you were seeing something they didn't want to acknowledge. Because once you make that shift, everything changes, the confusion starts to dissolve. The self-doubt begins to lose its grip, and you can finally separate your perception from their reaction. You were not dismissed because you lacked understanding. You were dismissed because your understanding arrived too early, before the situation was ready to reveal itself, and early truth often sounds like error to those who are not yet able to see it. So instead of carrying the weight of those labels they placed on you, instead of replaying their words and questioning your own clarity, recognize what was really happening. You were identifying cracks in a structure that others were still pretending was solid, and the only way to maintain that illusion was to make you appear unreliable. But now that time has passed, now that things are beginning to surface, now that patterns are becoming visible, you can see that their dismissal did not change the truth. It only delayed the moment when that truth would become undeniable. And after being dismissed enough times, after feeling that subtle pressure to shrink your awareness so that others could stay comfortable, you made a choice that looked like retreat on the outside, but was actually refinement on the inside, because instead of continuing to explain yourself to people who had already decided not to understand you, you became quiet, not out of defeat, not out of confusion, but out of a deeper instinct to observe without interference. And that silence they saw, that stillness they interpreted as you. Backing down was never what they thought it was, because while they assumed you had stopped seeing, you had actually started seeing more clearly than ever before. You stepped back, and in that step back, something shifted in the way you processed everything. Because when you are no longer trying to convince anyone, your perception sharpens. Your attention becomes more focused, and you begin to notice not just isolated moments, but entire patterns unfolding over time. And that is where your strength began to evolve from simple awareness into precise discernment. They thought your silence meant you were unsure that you had been corrected, that you had finally aligned with their version of reality. But what they didn't understand is that silence, when it comes from clarity, is not weakness. It is strategy. It is space. It is the decision to gather without interference, to watch without revealing what you know. And that kind of silence is often the most powerful position you can be in, because it allows truth to unfold naturally without being forced. You were no longer reacting to every inconsistency, no longer trying to point out every contradiction. Instead, you were letting things play out. Letting people speak, letting actions repeat, letting time expose what words could not. And in doing that, you began to see the full picture, not just fragments of it. And this is where most people misunderstand the nature of perception, because they think seeing is about quick conclusions, immediate reactions, or proving something right away. But true discernment is patient. It collects, it connects, it waits until the pattern becomes undeniable. And that is exactly what you were doing, even if you didn't have the language for it at the time. You were building clarity piece by piece, moment by moment, without needing external validation. And while others were comfortable operating on assumptions or surface-level interactions, you were mapping something deeper, something more consistent, something that could not be easily dismissed once it became fully visible. And because you stopped arguing, because you stopped trying to force others to see what you saw, they relaxed. They dropped their guard. They assumed the situation had settled, and in that assumption, they revealed more of themselves than they ever would have if you had continued to confront them directly. That is the irony of awareness. The less you push, the more is revealed, because people tend to expose themselves when they believe they are no longer being observed. They became comfortable again, and comfort leads to repetition. And repetition is what exposes patterns, and patterns are what confirm truth. So while they thought your silence meant the issue had disappeared, what was actually happening is that the issue was becoming clearer with every passing moment, every repeated behavior, every inconsistency that no longer needed to be questioned, because it had already shown itself multiple times. And in that process, something changed within you as well, because you were no longer looking for proof to convince others, you were recognizing confirmation for yourself. And that distinction is critical, because when your goal shifts from being understood to understanding, you gain a level of independence that cannot be easily shaken. You stopped needing their agreement to validate your perception, and once you reach that point, you are no longer easily manipulated by doubt or pressure, because your clarity is no longer tied to external responses. They may have continued to misread you, to assume you were unaware, to believe they had successfully redirected the narrative. But their assumptions were based on surface interpretation, not on the depth of what was actually happening inside you. You were not disengaged. You were focused. You were not confused. You were collecting. You were not blind. You were seeing in layers that they didn't even realize existed. And the more time passed, the more evident it became that your silence was not the absence of awareness, but the refinement of it, because everything you had sensed in the beginning was now being reinforced through observation, not speculation. You didn't need to guess anymore. You didn't need to question yourself the same way, because what was once subtle was now consistent. What was once a feeling was now a pattern, and what was once dismissed as overthinking was now aligning too precisely to be ignored. And this is the stage where many people either step into their clarity fully or retreat back into doubt, because the responsibility of seeing clearly comes with a certain weight. It requires you to accept that what you are recognizing may not be easy, may not be comfortable, may not fit into the narrative that others prefer to maintain. But you didn't turn away from it, even if it took time, even if you hesitated. You continued to observe, to process, to allow the truth to reveal itself at its own pace. And that patience is what separated your experience from everyone else's. You were not rushing to conclusions. You were allowing conclusions to form naturally based on consistent evidence. And that is why what you now understand carries a level of certainty that cannot be easily shaken, because it was not built on a single moment. It was built on a sequence, a structure, a pattern that repeated itself until it became undeniable. And now looking back, you can see that your silence was never ignorance. It was intelligence choosing the right timing. It was awareness choosing not to waste itself on people who were not ready to receive it. It was clarity choosing to grow stronger before stepping forward again. And that is why what comes next will not be based on assumption or reaction. It will be based on something far more solid, something that has been tested, observed, and confirmed over time. And after all that time spent observing, collecting, refining your understanding in silence, there came a moment when the pressure to remain quiet no longer made sense. Not because you suddenly needed to prove something, but because the clarity within you had reached a point where expression was no longer reactive. It was natural, it was grounded, it was precise. And when you finally spoke, it wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, it wasn't driven by emotion the way they might have expected. It was simple, direct, almost calm, to the point where it carried more weight than anything dramatic ever could. And that is what shifted everything. Because what you said did not sound like confusion. It did not sound like guessing. It sounded like someone who had been paying attention for a long time and was now stating what had already been established internally. And what happened next is what you need to understand deeply, because this is where the truth begins to reveal itself, not just in what is said, but in how others respond to it. And the reaction you received was not measured. It was not curious. It was not open. It was immediate, defensive, and disproportionate to the simplicity of what you expressed. And that kind of reaction is never random. You didn't accuse, you didn't attack, you didn't escalate yet. The energy that came back at you carried a level of urgency that didn't match your tone. And that mismatch is where confirmation begins, because when someone reacts strongly to something that was calmly stated, it is not the statement that triggered them, it is what the statement touched. Truth has a way of landing quietly, but exposure has a way of activating everything that has been trying to stay hidden. And in that moment, you weren't just speaking words, you were touching a structure. You were brushing against something that required defense in order to remain intact. You may have noticed how quickly the focus shifted away from what you said and onto how you said it, how you were perceived, how your character could be questioned. Because when a system cannot defend itself directly, it redirects attention to the one who is exposing it. And that redirection is often fast, instinctive, almost rehearsed, as if it has been used before, because in many cases it has. And this is where your awareness moved into another level, because you were no longer just observing patterns in behavior, you were now witnessing patterns in reaction. And reactions are often more revealing than actions, because they are less controlled, less filtered, more instinctive. The speed of the response, the intensity of the defense, the lack of genuine engagement with what you actually said, and all of these elements began to align with what you had been sensing all along. And in that alignment, something clicked, something settled inside you, in a way that no external validation ever could, because you were no longer relying on what they said to understand the situation. You were reading what their response revealed. And once you recognize that reactions are not just emotional responses, but indicators of what is being protected, you begin to understand the deeper structure of what you are dealing with, because no one defends something that is not connected to something they want to preserve. You might have questioned yourself in that moment, wondering if you had gone too far, if you had said too much, if you should have remained silent a little longer. But if you look closely, you will see that your words did not create the reaction, they exposed it. They brought it to the surface where it could no longer remain hidden under normal conversation. And this is why that moment is so important, because it marks the transition from internal clarity to external confirmation. It is the point where what you have been sensing begins to show itself in real time, not through explanations, but through behavior that cannot fully disguise itself under pressure. They may have tried to regain control of the narrative, to reframe the situation, to make it seem like the issue was your delivery, your timing, your perspective. But beneath all of that, the initial reaction had already told you what you needed to know, because genuine misunderstanding does not produce that kind of intensity, but exposure often does. And this is where many people make a mistake. They focus on the surface of the conversation, on the words, exchanged on who said what, instead of paying attention to the underlying energy of the interaction. The shifts in tone, the sudden defensiveness, the urgency to redirect the attempt to close the conversation before it goes deeper. And you saw that whether you fully understood it at the time or not, you felt that something had just revealed itself. Something that aligned too closely with your previous observations to be dismissed as coincidence. And once that realization takes hold, once you recognize that your simple statement triggered a reaction that exposed more than it intended to hide, you cannot go back to seeing things the same way, because now you have both sides of the equation. You have your internal awareness, and you have external confirmation through reaction. And when those two align, clarity becomes solid. You no longer need to question whether you were imagining things, because imagination does not produce consistent patterns across both perception and response, but truth does. And this is where the power of your position becomes evident, because you didn't force anything. You didn't manipulate the situation to get a reaction. You simply spoke from a place of grounded clarity, and the reaction came naturally, revealing exactly what had been beneath the surface all along. And now, as you look back on that moment, you can see that it was not just a conversation, it was a turning point. It was the moment where the gap between what you felt and what you could confirm began to close. And once that gap starts closing, everything that follows becomes easier to understand, because you are no longer operating in uncertainty. You are operating in recognition. They may still try to maintain appearances, they may still attempt to control how things are perceived, but something has already shifted, something has already been exposed, and once exposure begins, it does not reverse, it progresses, it unfolds. It continues to reveal itself in ways that become harder and harder to deny. Not because you are pushing it, but because truth once touched has a tendency to keep rising. And as that moment of reaction settled in your mind, as you replayed not just what was said, but how it was said, how quickly it escalated, how precisely it aligned with everything you had been sensing, in silence you began to realize something even deeper, something that shifted the entire scale of what you were dealing with. Because it was never just about one person, never just about one interaction, never just about a single misunderstanding that could be isolated and resolved. It was a pattern that extended beyond individuals, a network of behaviors that connected in ways that only became visible once you stepped back far enough to see the whole picture instead of individual pieces. At first, you may have tried to give each person the benefit of the doubt separately, analyzing actions one by one, assigning individual explanations, telling yourself that maybe this person didn't mean it that way. Maybe that reaction was just stress. Maybe that inconsistency was just a coincidence. But as time passed and your awareness sharpened, those separate explanations stopped holding up, because the same patterns kept appearing across different people in different moments with different faces, but carrying the same underlying structure. And that is when it becomes impossible to treat everything as isolated incidents. You started noticing how certain conversations seemed to echo each other, how information moved in ways that suggested it wasn't just randomly shared, how reactions from different people carried the same tone, the same defensive edge, the same subtle attempt to redirect focus away from what actually mattered. And when patterns repeat across multiple sources, you are no longer dealing with coincidence. You are dealing with coordination, whether intentional or unconscious. And this is where the deeper architecture of the situation revealed itself to you, because what once looked like scattered interactions began to form a system, a structure with roles, with functions, with dynamics that supported each other in maintaining a certain version of reality. There was the one who initiated, the one who subtly influenced the narrative, planting ideas in ways that seemed casual, but were anything but random, shaping perception without appearing to do so. There was the one who reinforced, who echoed the same ideas, not necessarily out of awareness, but because they had already accepted the narrative and were now participating in its spread, becoming a secondary source that made the original idea seem more credible. There was the one who observed, but chose silence, who saw enough to question, but not enough to act, and in their silence allowed the pattern to continue, unchecked, not out of malice, but out of comfort, out of a desire to avoid disruption. And then there was the one who became fixated, who seemed to orbit around you in ways that felt disproportionate, whose attention was not neutral, but charged, whose presence carried an intensity that didn't match the surface of the relationship. And that intensity often points to something deeper, something unresolved, something that cannot be easily explained, but is clearly felt. And as you began to see these roles not as separate personalities, but as parts of a larger mechanism, everything started to make sense in a way it hadn't before. Because you were no longer trying to understand individuals in isolation, you were understanding a system in motion. You realized that what you had been experiencing was not random confusion, but a structured, dynamic one that maintained itself through repetition, through reinforcement, through subtle alignment between people who may not even realize they are participating in the same pattern. And this realization changes everything, because once you see the system, you stop taking each interaction personally. You stop wondering why each person behaves the way they do in isolation, and you start recognizing that their behavior is part of something larger, something that operates beyond individual intention. You begin to see how narratives are maintained, how perception is shaped, how certain truths are avoided, not because they are unknown, but because acknowledging them would disrupt the balance that the system depends on. And when you reach this level of understanding, something shifts inside you, because the confusion that once made you question yourself is replaced by clarity that allows you to see without needing constant validation. You are no longer reacting to each moment as if it is new. You are recognizing it as part of a pattern you have already identified, and that recognition brings a kind of calm, a kind of detachment that is not cold but grounded, because you are no longer caught in the surface of the situation. You are anchored in its structure. They may still interact the same way, they may still repeat the same behaviors, they may still attempt to maintain the same narrative, but for you it no longer carries the same weight, because you understand where it comes from. You understand how it functions, and once you understand the system, you are no longer easily pulled into it. And this is where your position becomes powerful in a different way, not through confrontation, not through exposure in a dramatic sense, but through awareness that is steady, consistent, and unshaken by surface-level changes. You are no longer trying to fix what is happening. You are observing it with clarity, and that clarity itself begins to shift how you move, how you respond, how you engage, because you are no longer operating from confusion, you are operating from understanding. And the more you see, the more you realize that what once felt overwhelming was not because you lacked clarity, but because you were seeing parts of a system before you had the full view, and now that the full view is forming, everything that once felt disconnected is aligning into something coherent. Something that explains not just what happened, but why it happened the way it did. And in that understanding, you reclaim something that was slowly being taken from you during the earlier stages of this experience. You reclaim trust in your perception, not blindly, not reactively, but with a grounded certainty that comes from having observed, analyzed, and confirmed over time. And that kind of trust cannot be easily shaken, because it is built on patterns, not on isolated moments. It is built on consistency, not on assumptions. And once you reach that point, you are no longer navigating confusion. You are navigating truth, even if that truth is still unfolding. And as your understanding of the system deepened, as the patterns became too consistent to ignore and too structured to dismiss, something inside you made a quiet but powerful shift, because you realized that continuing to explain yourself, continuing to push for acknowledgement, continuing to try to make others see what you had already seen was no longer necessary, and more importantly, it was no longer effective, because truth does not require constant defense when it is rooted in reality. It only requires space to reveal itself, and that is exactly what you gave it. You stepped back, not in defeat, not in avoidance, but in alignment with a deeper understanding that some things are not meant to be forced into the light. They are meant to rise into it on their own. You stopped repeating yourself. You stopped revisiting conversations that were designed to go in circles. You stopped offering clarity to people who had already shown that they were not interested in receiving it. And in doing so, you removed something that had been unintentionally sustaining the dynamic: your energy, your attention, your willingness to engage. Because every time you tried to explain, every time you tried to prove, every time you tried to bring resolution through words, you were feeding a structure that depended on your participation to keep the cycle going. But when you withdrew that participation, when you chose observation over explanation, something began to change, not immediately, not dramatically at first, but subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a shift in pressure that you could feel before you could fully see it. Because systems that rely on distortion need constant reinforcement, and when that reinforcement is removed, cracks begin to form, not because you are attacking them, but because they are no longer being maintained in the same way. And this is where the process of exposure truly begins, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through absence, through the removal of resistance, because when you stop engaging with distortion, it loses its ability to hide behind reaction. It is left to stand on its own, and when it stands on its own, it begins to reveal what it actually is. You may have noticed how things started to surface without your involvement, how contradictions that were once easy to overlook became more visible, how inconsistencies that were once subtle became harder to ignore, how people began to reveal themselves through their own actions, their own words, their own inability to maintain the same narrative over time. You didn't have to point it out anymore. You didn't have to highlight it. You didn't have to bring attention to it, because it was becoming apparent on its own. And that is one of the most powerful positions you can be in, when truth begins to speak for itself without requiring your voice to carry it. And understand this clearly, this is not coincidence. This is what happens when illusion is no longer being actively supported, because illusion requires consistency to survive. It requires alignment between words and perception. And when that alignment begins to break even slightly, it creates visible fractures that cannot be easily repaired, especially when there is no longer someone there trying to smooth them over, trying to explain them away, trying to make them make sense. You stopped doing that. You allowed things to exist as they were. And in doing so, you allowed reality to show itself in its raw form, unfiltered, unprotected, uncorrected by external influence. And as this process unfolded, something else became clear to you, something that shifted your role entirely, because you were no longer in a position of needing to expose anything. You were in a position of witnessing exposure as it happened naturally. And that changes the entire dynamic. Because when you are the one trying to expose something, you are often met with resistance, with denial, with counter-arguments designed to maintain control. But when exposure happens through the actions of those involved, it carries a different weight, a weight that is harder to challenge because it is not coming from interpretation. It is coming from demonstration. People reveal who they are over time, not through what they say in controlled moments, but through what they do consistently, especially when they believe they are not being closely observed. And that is exactly the environment you allowed to exist. You stepped back enough that they felt comfortable again, that they believed the situation had settled, that whatever tension once existed had dissolved, and in that comfort, they returned to their natural patterns, repeating behaviors that when seen once might be dismissed, but when seen repeatedly become undeniable. And this is where the truth begins to solidify in a way that cannot be easily shaken, because it is no longer based on perception alone. It is supported by consistent observable reality. And once that alignment is established, once what you felt internally is confirmed externally, through repeated evidence, the need for validation disappears, because you are no longer questioning whether you were right. You are recognizing that what you sensed was simply ahead of its time. You may have also noticed how the energy around you began to shift as this happened, how conversations changed, how certain people became more cautious, how others became more distant, how the dynamic itself began to adjust in response to the subtle but undeniable changes taking place. And that shift is not random either. It is a response to the exposure that is unfolding, because when something that was once hidden begins to surface, it alters the environment. It changes how people interact, how they communicate, how they position themselves within the system. Some will try to adapt to adjust their behavior in ways that attempt to maintain control, while others will withdraw, recognizing that the structure they once relied on is no longer as stable as it appeared to be. And in the middle of all of this, you remain grounded, not because everything has become clear to everyone else, but because it has become clear to you, and that clarity allows you to move differently, to respond differently, to engage differently. You are no longer reacting to what is happening. You are understanding it, and that understanding gives you a level of stability that cannot be easily disrupted, because it is not dependent on external agreement. It is rooted in internal recognition, supported by external confirmation. And this is where the final layer of this process becomes evident, because as truth continues to expose itself, as patterns become more visible, as actions continue to align with what you have already recognized, the system that once seemed complex begins to lose its complexity, not because it has changed, but because you now see it clearly, and what is clearly seen no longer has the same power to confuse or control. You are no longer trying to solve it. You are no longer trying to fix it. You are simply aware of it. And that awareness is enough, because awareness, when it is grounded and consistent, creates distance between you and the dynamic itself, a distance that allows you to choose how you engage rather than being pulled into reaction. And that is the true shift that has taken place, not just in what is being exposed around you, but in how you relate to it. Because you are no longer the one being questioned. You are no longer the one being dismissed. You are no longer the one trying to make sense of something that doesn't align. You are the one who has seen the pattern, stepped back from it, and allowed it to reveal itself fully. And in doing so, you have moved into a position of clarity that does not need to be defended, because it is continuously being confirmed by reality itself. And now, as everything that once felt uncertain has begun to align into something unmistakably clear, you are standing in a realization that changes not only how you see the past, but how you understand yourself, because what they once called paranoia is now revealing itself as perception that arrived before its time. And that shift in understanding is not small, it is foundational. It redefines the entire narrative you were made to carry about yourself, because for a long time you were holding two conflicting realities at once: what you felt internally and what you were told externally. And when those two do not match, it creates a kind of pressure that forces you to question your own clarity, to second-guess your understandings, to wonder if it would be easier to just align with what everyone else accepts rather than standing in something that isolates you. But now that the evidence has surfaced, now that the patterns have unfolded, now that the reactions, behaviors, and outcomes have all begun to mirror what you sensed from the beginning, that internal conflict starts to dissolve, because you are no longer trying to reconcile two opposing narratives. You are recognizing that one of them was never accurate to begin with. You were not paranoid, you were early, and being early often feels like being wrong when you are surrounded by people who have not yet reached the same point of awareness, because timing plays a powerful role in perception. What is obvious later can feel invisible at first, and those who see it first are often misunderstood until reality catches up. You were carrying awareness ahead of confirmation, and that gap made it easy for others to label you not because they had evidence that you were wrong, but because they did not yet have the capacity to see what you were seeing. And instead of admitting that limitation, it was easier for them to project uncertainty onto you. But now the same things that were once dismissed are becoming visible not through your explanation, not through your effort to prove anything, but through the natural unfolding of events, through patterns that have repeated enough times to become undeniable. And in that unfolding, something else becomes clear, something that may be uncomfortable but is necessary to acknowledge the people who once questioned you are now confronted with the reality that your perception was accurate, and that realization often does not come with apology. It comes with silence, with subtle shifts, with an unspoken acknowledgement that something has changed, and that silence is its own form of confirmation. You may have noticed it the way conversations have adjusted, the way certain topics are avoided, the way the energy around you feels different, not because everything has been openly addressed, but because something has been internally recognized. And even if it is not spoken, it is felt, and that feeling carries more truth than words ever could. And this is where your role shifts again, because you are no longer the one trying to be understood, you are the one who understands. And that position comes with a different kind of responsibility, not to prove, not to confront, but to move with clarity, to trust what you see without needing constant reassurance, to operate from a place that is no longer shaken by the opinions of those who could not see what you saw when it mattered most. You have to understand the journey you went through was not just about identifying a situation. It was about developing a level of discernment that cannot be easily influenced, a level of awareness that has been tested through doubt, through dismissal, through isolation, and has still remained intact. And that kind of awareness is not common. It is built through experience, through moments where you had to choose whether to trust yourself or to conform to what others were saying. And even when you hesitated, even when you questioned, you never fully abandoned your perception. And that is why you are here now, not just seeing clearly, but knowing that you can trust what you see. And that trust is not arrogance. It is not about believing you are always right. It is about recognizing that your awareness operates on a level that picks up on patterns, on inconsistencies, on underlying dynamics that are not always immediately visible. And once you understand that, you stop treating your perception as something that needs to be suppressed or corrected, and you start treating it as something that needs to be refined and respected. Because the truth is, your discernment is not just about this one situation, it is about how you will navigate everything moving forward. It is about the standards you will hold, the boundaries you will set, the environments you will choose to engage with or step away from. And that is where the real shift happens, not just in recognizing what has been exposed, but in deciding how you will move now that you see it. You are no longer the same person who first felt that subtle discomfort, who first questioned whether what you were sensing was valid. You have moved through a process that has strengthened your ability to observe, to process, to understand. And now you are in a position where you can apply that clarity in a way that protects your peace, that aligns with your growth, that prevents you from being pulled into situations that do not match the level of awareness you now carry. And this is where many people make a critical mistake. They use their clarity to revisit the past, to replay conversations, to wish they had said something differently, to imagine how things could have unfolded if they had trusted themselves sooner. But that is not the purpose of this awareness. The purpose is not to rewrite what has already happened. It is to inform how you move forward, because the past has already served its function. It has shown you what you needed to see. It has revealed patterns that you can now recognize more quickly. It has strengthened your ability to trust your perception, even when it is not immediately validated. And that is the real value of what you have gone through. You are no longer operating from uncertainty. You are operating from experience, and experience, when it is integrated properly, becomes wisdom, something that guides you without needing constant analysis, something that allows you to recognize alignment or misalignment much earlier than before, something that gives you the confidence to step back when something doesn't feel right, without needing to justify that decision to anyone else. And as you stand in this clarity, as you fully accept that what you were sensing was never baseless, that what you were told about yourself was never accurate, you begin to reclaim something that may have been slowly eroded during the earlier stages of this experience. Your self-trust, your confidence in your own perception, your ability to stand in what you know without needing external agreement. And that reclamation is powerful because it shifts you out of a reactive state into a grounded one, where you are no longer easily influenced by how others respond to you, where your understanding is not dependent on validation, where your awareness is not something you question every time it challenges the surface of what is being presented. And this is where your growth becomes visible, not necessarily to others in a way that they can fully articulate, but in the way you carry yourself, in the way you engage, in the way you choose what deserves your attention and what does not, because clarity naturally creates boundaries. It naturally filters what you allow into your space. It naturally shifts your standards in a way that does not require explanation, because it is rooted in understanding rather than reaction. And as you continue forward, as you move into environments, relationships, and situations, with this level of awareness, you will begin to notice something else, something that confirms this transformation even further. You will recognize patterns earlier. You will sense misalignment sooner. You will trust your instincts more quickly, not because you are assuming the worst, but because you have learned how to read what is beneath the surface without needing everything to be spelled out for you. And that is the true elevation that has taken place, not just that you were right about what you sensed, but that you have become someone who can navigate complexity with clarity. Someone who can stand in awareness without being overwhelmed by it. Someone who can allow truth to reveal itself without feeling the need to force it. And that is a level of strength that cannot be easily shaken because it is built on something deeper than opinion. It is built on recognition, on pattern, on experience that has been tested and confirmed over time. And now, as you look at everything that has unfolded, as you see how what once felt uncertain has become undeniable, you can finally release the weight of those labels that were placed on you. You can let go of the idea that you were overthinking, that you were too sensitive, that you were imagining things, because none of those narratives hold up in the presence of what has now been revealed. You were aware, you were observant, you were aligned with something that others were not ready to see. And now that reality has caught up, there is nothing left to prove, nothing left to defend, only a deeper understanding of who you are and how you see the world. And that understanding is not something that can be taken from you, because it has been earned through experience, through patience, through the willingness to stay present with what you felt, even when it was not easy, even when it was not validated, even when it would have been simpler to ignore it. And that is why this moment matters, not because it confirms the past, but because it defines the future. It sets the foundation for how you will move, how you will trust, how you will engage. And once you step into that fully, once you stop questioning what has already been proven to you, you move into a different level of clarity, one that does not require constant reassurance, one that does not depend on external agreement, one that allows you to see, to understand, and to move with a sense of certainty that is quiet but unshakable. And that is something no label, no dismissal, no misunderstanding can ever take away from you again. And as you arrive at this point, where everything that once felt scattered has come together into something undeniable, you begin to understand that this was never just about proving that you were right. It was about transforming how you see, how you trust, and how you move through the world from this moment forward, because the greatest shift did not happen outside of you. It happened within you in the way you learned to hold on to your awareness, even when it was challenged, in the way you stayed present with what you felt, even when it was dismissed, in the way you allowed time and truth to do what force never could. And now that everything is exposing itself, you are no longer searching for validation. You are standing in confirmation. You are no longer the person who questions every instinct, who second-guesses every perception, who looks to others to tell you what is real. You have stepped into a level of clarity that is grounded, earned, and unshakable, and that clarity will guide you long after this moment has passed, shaping the choices you make, the people you allow into your space, and the standards you refuse to compromise. Because once you see patterns this clearly, you cannot unsee them, and more importantly, you no longer want to. So take this moment as more than just a realization. Take it as a reset, a recalibration of how you trust yourself moving forward, because what you went through was not meant to confuse you. It was meant to refine you, to sharpen your discernment to a level that protects your peace and aligns you with truth without needing constant explanation. And if this message resonated with you, don't let it end here. Take a second right now to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. I see clearly now. Because when you speak that out, when you claim that clarity, you are not just acknowledging what has been revealed, you are stepping fully into the version of yourself that no longer doubts what it sees, and that is where everything begins to change.